All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mitch Baalman. I work for the United States Wildlife Service at Illinois River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge Complex. Now, this presentation, Habitat Management Adapted Ground at Illinois River, was made by my colleague, Jacob Randa, and I will be presenting it on his behalf. And it is about how we need to adjust our management at refuges like Chautauqua in order to account for the changing landscape on the Illinois River. And in the case of Chautauqua, it is adapt or watch that refuge kind of become non-functioning. So Illinois River is kind of a blanket term. It's an umbrella term that captures three different refuges, Chautauqua, Meredosia, and Emiquon. These three refuges are about 13,000 acres in total and encompass about 120 river miles of the Illinois River. Now, we manage primarily for migratory birds at these refuges. In the case of Chautauqua and Meredosia, it's actually federally mandated. So our purpose here is to create habitat for migratory birds, for waterfowl, for shorebirds. And to get an idea of what we try to do every year, here's a picture of Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge in the Illinois River. Early in the spring, it is flooded. We take that flooded land and use our infrastructure to draw it down as much as possible during the summer. And hopefully by fall, we end up with this picture here. I believe this was from 2012, but essentially it's a large amount of area with tons of emergent, high quality vegetation that is great for migratory waterfowl as they stop over at the refuge on their migration. All right, so this presentation is going to be a little bit about, make sure you guys still see me here.
You're good, Mitch. Okay.
So in this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Illinois River, kind of how we got to this new landscape on the Illinois River, the flood damage that we have seen because of that new shift, and how we're adapting to that new flood management, and maybe we kind of picture what Chautauqua or what some of these refuges might look like moving forward. So I'm going to give a brief history here of the Illinois River. One of the first things you'll notice is that the Illinois River is heavily used for the commercial transportation of goods. And that's been its primary management for the past 150 years. But it is also an underutilized river valley. So that basically means it is a small river and a very large floodplain. And I get into that on another presentation, and something that's fun to talk about. But essentially that means wildlife love to use this area because the floodplain is huge. And when you get a small flood in the spring, it can cover a large amount of area, and that attracts tons of wildlife and people, which is why we use it as well. The history of kind of the transformation of the river kind of starts in the mid-1800s when the Illinois-Michigan Canal opens that connected the Great Lakes to the Illinois River. And then a little later on, the locks and dams open, which are great for moving those goods down the Illinois River. But at the same time, each one of those dams actually raises the river level 2 to 5 feet. So farmers actually had to kind of combat that issue by raising their dikes, by raising their levees in order to keep that rising water out of their fields. So that's where we kind of get this system of higher river levels and higher dikes and levees around the river. In 1900, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal opened up. That really connected the Great Lakes to the river. Now we see all kinds of commercial traffic from the Great Lakes going down the Illinois River. But we now get a lot of that Chicago runoff and pollution from urbanization down the Illinois River as well. In the early 1900s, you started getting these meetings of drainage and levee districts. And I just point that out to show that that these districts have been going on for about 100 years, and they play an important part of how the watershed of the Illinois River functions. And of course, in 1936, Chautauqua was created based off of a failed management or a failed drainage and levee district. So all of these effects, so the culmination of all of these factors in combination with modern agricultural practices and climate change, have kind of created a monster here where it be hard to design a better system for quickly transporting the water off of the watershed of the Illinois River and into the river. This has created more floods, higher magnitudes, and a longer duration of floods. What does flood look like on the Illinois River and at Chautauqua? So if you notice in the center of this picture here, this is our levee. So the levee protects the Chautauqua and allows us to manage. So allows us to actively manage Chautauqua to draw it down in the summer. So it's 16.5 feet Havana gauge. That's around 441 sea level. That's when it starts coming over our spillway or under flood stage. And we needed to get it down to about 7 feet before we can create that good quality emergent habitat that's great for waterfowl in the fall. And then the number on the top right there is the flood of record in Havana. And that's a 20-foot difference. So that is a lot of water to make up in a given year. So my next graph I'm going to show you here, and it's the only graph I have, it shows the increase in flood duration by decade over about the past 100 years. So that solid line there is the average number of days over 16 feet, which is when we were flooding at Chautauqua, per decade. So you notice that line, that average is slowly increasing. And you can also notice, like in the last 5 to 10 years, it has been incredibly wet. And some years we are getting almost 150 days, if not more than 150 days over flood stage. And what does that mean? So when we have longer and longer floods, that means we have a shorter amount of time to do all the work that we need to do every single year. And because we are getting so much flood damage, we have more to do in less amount of time. So there's less and less time spent on actual habitat management. So in the picture here, you're seeing kind of what it looks like when a flood hits our refuge. The first thing that you'll notice is all the debris. So we get a lot of debris that piles up on our refuge. Some of it is self-inflicted, but that debris needs to be cleaned off before we can even start to assess the damage that we are seeing. And we have two major types of damage on the refuges. There's overtopping damage and wave damage. So what you're seeing here is some overtopping damage, and that happens when the water on the Illinois River raises so fast that we are not able to equalize the pools. So when we know that the river is going to flood over the levees, we'll rush into the refuge as quickly as possible. We'll open up the gates and try to equalize the pools. But because the river is coming up so fast now that we don't even have an opportunity to equalize the pools, and the water still come over. And we end up patching these holes, but the patches never work as well as the original levee, and we end up just creating a sponge cake of a levee out there where the same holes keep opening up year after year. Our biggest source of damage is probably wave damage, though. So this is a picture of wave damage, and that just happens because with 150 days out of the year where the water is sitting right at the height of our spillways, right at the height of our levees, those waves just eat away. And there's quarter-mile sections throughout the refuge where you have about a 4 to 5 foot step off that we can't fix at the moment. So this is just some more flooding pictures from 2013 when it was going over the North and South Globe, and 2015 when those levees finally blew out, and that's about a 20-foot blowout and 200 feet across. And I kind of show those pictures in there because it's not just affecting our habitat management capabilities, it's also affecting our visitor experience. So all of that visitor services aspect gets destroyed during floods as well. And we also have a lot of public damage that is not owned by us. So if you've ever driven to Dixon Mounds Museum, you definitely don't want to slip a tire over the shoulder, or you might just fall into the water. So we see all this flooding damage. Now, how do we adapt our management? Right now, we are throwing more punches. So anytime there's an opportunity to make quality emergent or moist soil habitat, we get out there and we basically get the water off. We do whatever type of management we need to do to create moist soil, create emergent vegetation. Now, just because we can't always draw down at the most opportune time, that doesn't mean a drawdown at different times of the year aren't valuable. A lot of times we can't get the water off the refuge until July and August. Historically, we wouldn't have even tried after that point, but now we're beginning to do more and more drawdowns late in the year. Even though it might not be great for waterfowl, it creates great mud habitat, which is great for soil consolidation, for producing emergent vegetation in following years. It's also great shorebird habitat. And there's increasing evidence that shows these drawdowns in non-specific times of the year might even aid in invasive fish control. But one thing we've noticed, and if you've been to the north or south globe of Emiquon National Wildlife Refuge, you've noticed that the past 5 years have been incredibly high water, but it's also produced amazing habitat over there. So we're shifting where we do certain types of habitat or management in order to create kind of a gradient of different types of habitat throughout the landscape. So it's really about looking at a landscape level type of management instead of focusing on a specific historic regime for a specific unit. So now that we kind of know what type of management we need to shoot for, how do we adapt our infrastructure to make that management happen? We need to increase passive management. So that's the use of spillways, the use of infrastructure that doesn't need to be manipulated by us. It's armoring levees with riprap. It's using floodwaters to our advantage, flooding units that might not have historically been flooded, but we can still create habitat there. It's removing structures that don't work anymore, because even when structures don't work, you still have to maintain them. All this essentially means we need to make infrastructure that allows us in the future to spend more money, not on repairs, not on flooding, fixing flooding, but using those resources to actually make quality habitat. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about here is, how do we define success? So this point I'll stress is that acres of habitat are no longer a determinant factor of success for us. Some years, a couple years ago, we had pretty decent habitat at Chautauqua. That was kind of luck. That wasn't just because we did everything right. Some years the floods come in when you do everything right. Some years you don't get a chance to do anything, and you still have good habitat. So success is increasing the probability of creating quality habitat. And how do we do that? We do that with data-driven management. We are collecting bathymetry data. We're collecting real water, kind of real-time water level monitoring, and we're creating up-to-date flood probabilities. And we're going to use all this data to make a decision tree to determine when and how we can manage our habitat. So essentially answer the question, if it's July 15th and the water is just now dipping below our levees, what is the % chance that we can create quality habitat if we turn on the pump right now? And those kind of decisions help plan our infrastructure in the future. With that, I'll end my presentation. I think I got about 5 minutes here to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, briefly there, we did shut off your video just to improve the connection there. There are some, some questions coming in. Doug will help address those.
Thanks, Mitch. One question is, could you briefly describe the difference between shorebird management and waterfowl management?
Sure. And I would say that it doesn't have to be a difference. A lot of times you can manage for both. So at Chautauqua, for instance, that peak shorebird migration might be late summer or early fall. And so if we are creating mudflat habitat around that time, doing that kind of later drawdown, we can still create habitat for waterfowl by creating or by doing that early enough to get emergent vegetation. So they don't have to be, they're not independent of each other. We can sometimes do both, but in those years when we can't, it's just too late to do waterfowl, manage for waterfowl, we can still do shorebird habitat.
Good. As river levels rise, near river habitats are pushed further up on the floodplain. Is the service actively acquiring lands further up on the floodplain to provide those types of habitats?
Other places in our region, which is the Great Lakes region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, are doing that. It is in our ability, it's within our acquisition boundaries, what we call it, to acquire lands. We haven't been able to recently, but that is something we're definitely going to look into because, I mean, there's a lot of land where that is now being flooded and may not be appropriate for farming anymore. So if we can look at some of those areas where it's no longer going to be productive for farming, and maybe look at how we can use those to mitigate the amount of flooding and still create habitat, we're definitely going to look into that.
Good.